Hello and welcome to today's Manhattan Project Town Meeting of the LaRouche Organization for Saturday, March 25th. We're going to start today by asking you to consider the meaning of the following report that appeared on the Reuters news service this past Sunday, March 19th, in the hours before the Monday morning opening of financial markets. Bern, March 19th. Union Bank of Switzerland, or UBS, agreed to buy rival Swiss bank Credit Suisse for 3 billion Swiss francs, or $3.23 billion in stock, and agreed to assume up to 5 billion francs, or $5.4 billion worth of losses in a shotgun merger engineered by Swiss authorities to avoid more market-shaking turmoil in global banking. The deal includes 100 billion Swiss francs, or $108 billion in liquidity assistance for UBS and Credit Suisse from the Swiss Central Bank. How is it possible that Credit Suisse, previously described as a member of that club of institutions declared to be too big to fail, could be purchased for less than the ostensible net worth of Donald Trump or Oprah Winfrey and Tyler Perry together? Think about it. What did Elon Musk pay for Twitter? Wasn't it over $40 billion? Credit Suisse is purchased for $3.2 billion. And then we are told that Switzerland, the Swiss National Bank, is providing as a backstop for one bailout the same or nearly the equivalent money that the United States just deployed for the entire war in Ukraine. Something more than has been admitted is clearly going on. We have a bankrupt financial system, a system that's been officially effectively bankrupt, if you will, since 2007, 2008, and the bailouts of that period. We now find ourselves in a situation which we were told we were never going to reach again, and we have nearly incomprehensible gyrations going on in the financial markets. But this is, if anything, only an indication of the real problem that humanity is facing. For example, how do we find our way out of what appears to be a no-win conflict between the NATO countries and Russia and China? It would seem that the world is in that sort of danger right now. But that was also apparently the case back in the 1980s. And that apparently insoluble situation was resolved in principle by the thinking and the actions of Lyndon LaRouche and President Ronald Reagan with regard to the then very real possibility of an impending annihilation war with the then existent Soviet Union. Lyndon LaRouche described the conflict and its means of resolution to a conference of the Schiller Institute.
February 1982, I held a conference, a very largely attended conference in Washington, D.C. It was 400 or 500 celebrities of various nations, largely military and others, U.S. government, East Bloc governments, European, Western European governments. And I presented at that time what I presented as the alternative to Kissinger's policy. This is the policy which became known as Strategic Defense Initiative. Now, the important thing is to understand what the original SDI was, contrary to the idiocy which you hear in the press today about missile defense, which what you hear in the press is idiocy by people who are worse than idiots, and they don't know anything about missile defense. So what we have to do is something completely different. We do have the ability to devise systems, new kinds of physical systems, which could deal effectively with thermonuclear missiles, that is, render them effectively technologically obsolete down the line. But that was not the extent of my proposal. The proposal was that instead of having the Soviet Union and the United States engaged in this crazy chicken game called SALT I and ABM, why don't we find a way out of the conflict itself? How? Because the Soviet economy, like the U.S. economy, is collapsing. The present policies of the U.S. economy, the present policies of the Soviet economy ensure a collapse of those economies, physical collapse. So why don't we change the policy? Why don't we go back to the space program of Kennedy? And let's do what we proved with Kennedy. Remember, according to the estimates which were made in the middle of the 1970s, the United States got more than a dime of additional GNP out of every penny the United States invested in the space program, the Kennedy space program. The point is that since increases in productivity come directly only from improvements in technology derived from fundamental scientific discoveries, the higher the rate you convert fundamental physical discoveries into practice, the greater the rate of increase of productivity per capita of population and per square kilometer of area. The problem of both the Soviet system and our own, though in different degrees, I said at the time, was that the United States was not generating a rate of net growth in physical productivity sufficient to maintain the economy. Therefore, we needed a program for forced draft, science-driven, technological progress with some mission, like the moon mission, but as a byproduct of that mission, such as the moon mission, we would generate spillovers in terms of technological progress by such a crash program to put the United States economy back on the plus side in terms of net.
A year after the February 1982 conference that just was described by Lyndon LaRouche, President Ronald Reagan delivered the following remarks as the conclusion to a nationally televised special address to the nation on March 23, 1983.
I've shared with you my thoughts on the problems of national security we must face together. My predecessors in the Oval Office have appeared before you on other occasions to describe the threat posed by Soviet power and to propose steps to address that threat. But since the advent of nuclear weapons, those steps have been increasingly directed toward deterrence of aggression through the promise of retaliation. This approach to stability through offensive threat has worked. We and our allies have succeeded in preventing nuclear war for more than 3 decades. In recent months, however, my advisors, including in particular the Joint Chiefs of Staff, have underscored the necessity to break out of a future that relies solely on offensive retaliation for our security. Over the course of these discussions, I've become more and more deeply convinced that the human spirit must be capable of rising above dealing with other nations and human beings by threatening their existence. Feeling this way, I believe we must thoroughly examine every opportunity for reducing tensions and for introducing greater stability into the strategic calculus on both sides. One of the most important contributions we can make is, of course, to lower the level of all arms, and particularly nuclear arms. We're engaged right now in several negotiations with the Soviet Union to bring about a mutual reduction of weapons. I will report to you a week from tomorrow my thoughts on that score. But let me just say I'm totally committed to this course. If the Soviet Union will join with us in our effort to achieve major arms reduction, we will have succeeded in stabilizing the nuclear balance. Nevertheless, it will still be necessary to rely on the specter of retaliation, on mutual threat. And that's a sad commentary on the human condition. Wouldn't it be better to save lives than to avenge them? Are we not capable of demonstrating our peaceful intentions by applying all our abilities and our ingenuity to achieving a truly lasting stability? I think we are. Indeed, we must. After careful consultation with my advisors, including the Joint Chiefs of Staff, I believe there is a way. Let me share with you a vision of the future which offers hope. It is that we embark on a program to counter the awesome Soviet missile threat with measures that are defensive. Let us turn to the very strengths in technology that spawned our great industrial base and that have given us the quality of life we enjoy today. What if free people could live secure in the knowledge that their security did not rest upon the threat of instant U.S. retaliation to deter a Soviet attack, that we could intercept and destroy strategic ballistic missiles before they reached our own soil or that of our allies? I know this is a formidable technical task, one that may not be accomplished before the end of this century. Yet current technology has attained a level of sophistication where it's reasonable for us to begin this effort. It will take years, probably decades of effort on many fronts. There will be failures and setbacks, just as there will be successes and breakthroughs. And as we proceed, we must remain constant in preserving the nuclear deterrent and maintaining a solid capability for flexible response. But isn't it worth every investment necessary to free the world from the threat of nuclear war? We know it is. In the meantime, we will continue to pursue real reductions in nuclear arms, negotiating from a position of strength that can be ensured only by modernizing our strategic forces. At the same time, we must take steps to reduce the risk of a conventional military conflict escalating to nuclear war by improving our non-nuclear capabilities. America does possess now the technologies to attain very significant improvements in the effectiveness of our conventional non-nuclear forces. Proceeding boldly with these new technologies, we can significantly reduce any incentive that the Soviet Union may have to threaten attack against the United States or its allies. As we pursue our goal of defensive technologies, we recognize that our allies rely upon our strategic offensive power to deter attacks against them. Their vital interests and ours are inextricably linked. Their safety and ours are one, and no change in technology can or will alter that reality. We must and shall continue to honor our commitments. I clearly recognize that defensive systems have limitations and raise certain problems and ambiguities. If paired with offensive systems, they can be viewed as fostering an aggressive policy, and no one wants that. But with these considerations firmly in mind, I call upon the scientific community in our country, those who gave us nuclear weapons, to turn their great talents now to the cause of mankind and world peace, to give us the means of rendering these nuclear weapons impotent and obsolete. Tonight, consistent with our obligations under the ABM Treaty and recognizing the need for closer consultation with our allies, I'm taking an important first step. I am directing a comprehensive and intensive effort to define a long-term research and development program to begin to achieve our ultimate goal of eliminating the threat posed by strategic nuclear missiles. This could pave the way for arms control measures to eliminate the weapons themselves. We seek neither military superiority nor political advantage. Our only purpose, one all people share, is to search for ways to reduce the danger of nuclear war. My fellow Americans, tonight we're launching an effort which holds the promise of changing the course of human history. There will be risks, and results take time, but I believe we can do it. As we cross this threshold, I ask for your prayers and your support. Thank you. Good night, and God bless you.
So what have we just watched? These two sets of remarks by Lyndon LaRouche and Ronald Reagan document a breakthrough in statecraft that shook up the world and was outside of the control of the Kissinger-dominated establishment of that time. But how was that done? We've now established that not only is there a principle and a method available to defusing the present collapsed financial system's failure-driven death march to total war, including thermonuclear war, now being carried out by the Anglo-NATO nations against Russia, China, and what some people call the global South, but is better called the global majority. We've provided a context for a historical precedent for how inspired citizens, without official roles in the present international political configuration, can, armed with an idea whose time has come, successfully change the direction of the world away from what is falsely believed to be tragically inevitable. Now, we've assembled a panel today for these discussions, which include Harley Schlanger, who's often here from the LaRouche organization, Bill Jones from the Washington Bureau and of the Executive Intelligence Review, and Paul Gallagher, co-editor of Executive Intelligence Review and former executive director of the Fusion Energy Foundation. We're going to start today with Harley first and then go to Paul. and then followed by Bill. So Harley, good to see you today, and you have the floor.
Well, thank you, Dennis, and very glad to be in this panel. As people now know, it was 40 years ago that there was a shock delivered by Ronald Reagan. But probably the bigger shock was the fact that it was known to key people in the US and in the Soviet Union that the idea came from Lyndon LaRouche. And what's crucial is to realize that what was started 40 years ago, and actually LaRouche was working on this for another decade and a half before this, not the SDI, but on how to shift away from the collapsing financial system, that what has happened over the period between then and now is we've gone through a series of crises, a series of changes in the world, most of which are for the worse. But what we're now seeing is a recognition that LaRouche and his warnings of the collapse, the necessary collapse of this old system, is coming into being. People recognize it, and there's a move to create a new system, one which is not dominated by one power, no hegemon. And we saw a very significant advance in that with the meetings, the summit the last couple of days of Presidents Putin and Xi Jinping, where they mapped out a deepening of the strategic partnership between the two countries. Now, this is causing massive panic in the West. The fear that, does this mean China is going to come in on the side of Russia and Ukraine? Well, it's actually much bigger than that, because the Ukraine situation will be settled probably on the battlefield because the West won't negotiate. When the Chinese made their proposal for peace, it was rejected out of hand by Biden, Blinken, and others. So while that situation continues to be a major danger with the threat of nuclear war hanging over us, we're seeing this new system coming into existence. Part of the reason for this is the accelerated degeneration of US so-called elites, the foreign policy establishment, the financial establishment, total control by neocons and neoliberals. On the strategic side, it's Brzezinski, Kissinger, their networks. Brzezinski's networks include Albright and Blinken. But as they continue to press ahead with the post-1991 idea of a unipolar order, we're seeing tremendous changes taking place. And so it's in this context that we see what happened after LaRouche's announcement, or LaRouche's work on the SDI and Reagan's announcement of it. We're seeing coming into existence this new system. Now, the SDI was opposed aggressively by the Soviets, key people in the Soviet Union, in the government, and also by people in the US establishment, especially people around Henry Kissinger and the Bush network. When the Soviet Union ultimately collapsed, this same network pursued a dual strategy. On the one hand, talking about partnership with Russia, but on the other hand, unleashing forces of destabilization, of looting, of an attempt to expand NATO eastward, even though they promised it wouldn't happen. And what happened was the assertion of this gang that we were now in a unipolar order with only one set of rules for economic and strategic policy. And this was imposed during the Yeltsin period. It was called shock therapy. During that period, we saw a launching of numerous wars, including the Iraq War, the Gulf War with Margaret Thatcher and Bush Sr. Later in the decade, the war of NATO in Yugoslavia. And inside Russia itself, while the talk was of partnership, the reality was a demographic crisis was set into motion. Now, during that whole period of time, Lyndon LaRouche was actively involved in continuing to push his concept that you could have peace, but it has to have an economic base, and the economic base for it is science and technological cooperation. And I'm sure you'll hear a lot about this from Paul in a few moments. But I want to just give you a couple of moments in that period, in the post-1991 period, which has brought us to this potential now for this gigantic shift, this tectonic shift in international relations that President Putin has talked about, that Putin and Xi Jinping have talked about, and that the NATO hierarchy is desperately trying to stop, using the Ukrainian population as the sledgehammer to try to weaken Russia, and preparing for a war against China in Taiwan. Now, in 1998, in December 1998, as Russia was in the midst of this demographic crisis, looting that was completely out of control, run by British bankers, Wall Street bankers, and Harvard intellectuals, Yevgeny Primakov, the prime minister, made a trip to India in December 1998. And he issued there a call for a strategic triangle, which would include Russia, India, and China, as nations that had common interests that were outside of the interests of this Wall Street, City of London new imperium. Now, 10 years or 11 years later, Lyndon LaRouche gave a speech at the Rhodes Conference, the Dialogue of Civilizations Conference in October 2009. I mean, during the period between Primakov's speech and LaRouche's 2009 speech, there were many different ideas put forward by Lyndon LaRouche, conceptions for economic cooperation on local and regional levels, as well as international levels, and always a fight for a new financial system. But at this Rhodes Conference speech, he concretized something which he called the four-power agreement. Now, it may be that the idea of the four-power agreement was expressed by LaRouche before this. I know in germ form it was. But here's what he said, and Jose, if you have the poster, if you could put that up, at the Rhodes Conference. Do we have that?
It's up.
Okay. The task, as I defined it, is if Russia and the United States and China and India agree as a group of countries to initiate and force a reorganization of the world financial and credit system, under those conditions with long-term agreements of the same type that Franklin Roosevelt had uttered before his death in 1944, under key nations, the intention of Roosevelt all these years later could have been realized, and we could do that today. Now, LaRouche continued, again, this is in 2009, that's our chance. Either we do that or we go under. I can assure you, if you think that there's any possibility that the present system could continue into the coming year as a system to work with, that there will not be a general continuing worsening crisis at the present time, there will be no economic recovery in any part of the planet under the present conditions. Now, of course, this was after the 2008 financial crisis. This was after the decision was made to bail out the bankrupt institutions, to kick the can down the road, so to speak, to reorganize, not to reorganize, but to avoid a reorganization. And so what we've seen since that time until up to 2019 was a proclamation by many, many governments about economic health, recovery, and so on. But all that recovered was the stock market. The real physical economy continued to be looted in every part of the world after the 2008 crisis. And it reemerged as a global crisis in 2019 with the so-called repo crisis in the United States, with a new wave, a fresh wave of trillions of dollars of quantitative easing to bail out the system. That system, as most of you know, is now in an advanced state of collapse. Whether they can pull the banking system together in the next few days is questionable. We've seen weekends meetings the last couple of weeks, sort of like the weekend at Bernie's back in 2008, where they're trying to figure out who should get bailed out, how much the bailout should be. How can you maneuver between the danger of hyperinflation with a bailout or without a bailout, the danger of a chain reaction collapse? Now, it's in these circumstances that we're seeing an incredible diplomatic revolution. And it's taken the form exactly as Lyndon LaRouche had proposed except for the involvement of the United States. Actually, it's Primakov's idea of Russia, India, and China. But the BRICS, which is an extension of that, the BRICS Plus, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, all these other regional organizations coming together, looking for ways to expand investment and trade, moving to the conclusion that it can't happen under the dollar system, that the present dollar system, the so-called rules-based order, will not allow them as sovereign nations to develop. And so what we're seeing is this emergence of a new system, what Helga Zepp-LaRouche has called for, a new strategic and development architecture that was part of the basis of the Putin-Xi collaboration. We saw in the last week the China intervention to achieve a rapprochement between Saudi Arabia and Iran. Syria, Assad went to Moscow and then he went to the United Arab Emirates, where they decided to bury the hatchet and become friends. Talks between Syria and Saudi Arabia. Well, the Saudis had been one of the leading funders of the terrorists in Syria, along with the CIA. But now we're seeing the Saudis and the Syrians looking to make peace. Armenia, Azerbaijan, a protracted conflict there appears to be on the verge of being settled. So what's the key to this? It's diplomacy, it's negotiation, it's compromise. But most importantly, it starts from the concept of the Peace of Westphalia, that sovereign states have a right to legitimate security interests, but the road to peace is to recognize the security interests of other nations and to act for their benefit. And that's what we're seeing happen now. I want to conclude my remarks with some fairly extraordinary statements from Sergei Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister, made to a publication called Razvedchik, which I think is a military intelligence publication. And he was commenting on the situation in the world today. Jose, if you can put that slide up. Lavrov wrote that, quote, "The world is abandoning the Anglo-American monopolar world order in favor of a world of multipolarity, in which a growing number of countries have an independent foreign policy, which prioritizes their core national interests." In other words, the recognition of the right to sovereignty and legitimate security concerns of every nation. Lavrov continues. He calls this a quote, "historic geopolitical shift, which puts in place objective factors for the emergence of a new multipolar world order," or a multilateral world order, he could have said, "a more resilient, just, and democratic framework reflecting the natural and inalienable right of every nation to determine its future, as well as choose its own internal and socioeconomic development models." Now, he went on saying that rather than accepting this shift, the US-led so-called collective West is doing everything to revive the unipolar model, which has run its course. They want to force the world to live in a Western-centric, rules-based order that they invented themselves, while seeking to punish those who disagree with these rules, even if no one has ever seen them, and they are nowhere to be found. The West's goal in Ukraine, he said, is to defeat us on the battlefield, destroy the Russian economy, and undermine our internal political stability. He concluded this article with the following words: "We have drawn the necessary conclusions from this. There will be no business as usual again. We will not knock on the closed door, let alone make unilateral concessions. To tell the truth, we no longer have any illusions about converging with Europe, being accepted as part of a common European home, or creating a common space with the EU. All these declarations made in European capitals have turned out to be a myth and a false flag operation." And so we see the move toward the new strategic and financial architecture. Now, let me just conclude with some comments from Secretary of State Antony Blinken, the protege of the murderous Madeleine Albright and the current Secretary of State, who refuses to even consider negotiating on the peace proposal put forward, or the basis for a peace proposal put forward by China. Blinken was asked to comment on the Chinese proposal and about why he's rejecting it. And he had this following statement. The US had tried with little success to persuade or compel China to abide by American rules. He didn't even try to persuade, but the idea of trying to get China to compel China to abide by these rules of the rules-based order. You heard Lavrov's comments on that. I think what's important now is that we have to set our sights on realizing the potential that Lyndon LaRouche saw in the Four Powers Agreement, which means that the three powers are already moving fairly well in this direction. We have the responsibility to get the United States to stop seeing itself as the world policeman or the world hegemon, and instead become a partner in the alliance for this new architecture. So those are my comments for this evening, for this afternoon.
Well, thanks a lot, Harley. If you just joined us, welcome to today's Manhattan Project Symposium of the LaRouche Organization for Saturday, March 25th. Before we go on, we want to make sure that you also know about a two-day conference of the Schiller Institute, which will be beginning 3 weeks from today on Saturday, April 15th. And it's called Without the Development of All Nations, There Can Be No Lasting Peace on the Planet. We want you to join that conference and also help to organize that conference. There will be an online conference, and that'll be being addressed by people from all over the world. We also want to make sure to call your attention to the call for an international emergency conference to reorganize the bankrupt financial system. This is authored by Helga Sepp LaRouche. We're going to hear more about that in the course of the rest of our remarks. I want to make sure that we can go to Paul now. I don't see him up on the screen. So if we don't have him, oh, you are there. Very good. Kansas couldn't see you. So Paul Gallagher, everybody, was on the scene 40 years ago when that process between Ronald Reagan and Lyndon LaRouche happened, but he's also on the scene now as director of the co-editor, of the Executive Intelligence Review. And it's sort of important that not only he says whatever he has to say about those earlier times, but Paul's been doing a lot of work to try to explain the nearly unexplainable in what's been going on or supposedly going on around these so-called financial markets. But there's a deeper process here altogether we're considering today, and that is, although it appears to be impossible to change the present circumstance just as it did 40 years ago, that's exactly what we're called upon to do. And so we're happy to have Paul here to try to deepen both our understanding about what's going on now and what went on then, and maybe help us go by or arrive at some sort of a solution in the course of the discussion as a whole. So Paul, welcome. You have the floor.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to try to bring that development 40 years ago and what LaRouche said about it in particular in retrospect in the 90s. I'm going to try to bring those into some, to throw some light on what we're going through now economically, which is being discussed all over the world as a bank crisis, which is actually the culmination of a productivity crisis in our economies. And it is no exaggeration to say that productivity crisis had hit shortly before LaRouche's SDI proposals were put forward by him as a solution, and that he very consciously intended them to solve that. So what I'd like to do to start is to go back and bring it up on my screen, and hopefully everyone else's. This already you heard from LaRouche at the beginning of the program. Dennis played that part of his Storm Over Asia. But I just want to really focus on it because he's commenting on his SDI policy, and he says that the point is that since increases in productivity come directly only from improvements in technology derived from fundamental scientific discoveries, the higher the rate you convert fundamental physical discoveries into practice, the greater the rate of increase of productivity per capita of population and per square kilometer of area. And then he talks about the problem, the Soviet system, and also the problem by that time, that is, by the time he proposed the SDI in the beginning in the late 70s, the problem was that the United States was not generating a rate of net growth in physical productivity sufficient to maintain the economy. Therefore, we needed a program for forced draft, science-driven, technological progress with some mission like the moon mission and so forth. That's exactly what he planned the SDI as, what Reagan called the Strategic Defense Initiative. Lynn sometimes referred to it by a kind of slogan, beam the bomb, but that was really for our organizing. He made that proposal consciously with the idea of the need for a worldwide laser industrial revolution. He spoke about that at length in one large conference attended by many hundreds of people, held by us in just a couple of months after Reagan's announcement. And that conference was called Beam the Bomb. That was its informal name. And he explained at length in his presentation keynote to that conference that it was a worldwide laser industrial revolution that was the aim of being set off by the policy of developing technologies militarily or in the military sphere to make defense capable against, reliable defense capable against thermonuclear missiles. And it's really important to keep this idea in mind because when you look at something else, if I can manage to scroll down here, maybe I can, yes. This is what was happening and it has continued to happen. The total factor productivity is not just labor productivity. How much does all the labor in the country produce in so many hours, divide the hours by the production, rather divide the production by the hours. It's not that. Total factor productivity is the attempt at a measure which perhaps comes closest to the kind of productivity that LaRouche was describing in what I just read to you again, what you heard before. That is, increases in an economy's productivity which come as much as possible directly, and in its growth, which come as much as possible directly from technological progress, in turn arising out of scientific discovery, and which come secondarily from improvements in public education, such that the labor force is better able to use the new technologies which emerge. That's what the idea of, or the measure of total factor productivity aims at. Just how precisely it achieves that aim is really beside the point here. What is clear is that that blue line, which is an estimate based on several studies, the Federal Reserve Bank of San Francisco, the Economist magazine, the Center for the Study of Income and Productivity, several studies and others concluded very much the same thing, that total factor productivity in the United States economy had a steady rate of growth in that period from 1947 up till the early 1970s. That is the point at which the Bretton Woods system of FDR, such as it was implemented, that system had produced that kind of rate of technological productivity And in the early 70s, that stopped, as you can very clearly see from the trend line, which is the brownish line, which continues, average annualized rate of 0.8% per year. And that's a GDP growth rate. And the growth instead of actual total factor productivity, which lagged far below that and essentially virtually stopped growing. Here is another approximation of that. This is an IMF study. Again, it was published in the Financial Times in an article which was written in 2014 and very hopefully speculating that this process was going to be reversed. It was not. It got worse. But this shows you a long period of time. The lower darker blue line here is total productivity, total factor productivity growth declining. And again, the big decline starting right after 1970 without the Bretton Woods system, with the dollar basis of the gold reserve no longer being present, and with massive speculation in currencies and floating exchange rates, that technological productivity drops steadily. And by the period after the last financial crash, the period in the middle of the 20-teens, it had hit zero and was going below. And in fact, since 2017, as nearly as it has been computed by the National Bureau of Economic Research, it has been negative. Negative productivity growth, decline in technological productivity in the U.S. economy as a whole. So these are the impacts of what LaRouche was addressing himself to with what you might call, and he identified it very clearly, the civilian side, the laser industrial revolution side of the Strategic Defense Initiative as he proposed it, as he intended it, and as Reagan tried to launch it. That was clearly what he was aiming at. And in addition, the fact that with the revival of that kind of technological productivity in the advanced economies, they would then be in a position to export high technology capital goods into the developing countries in order to bring about, as he said, a worldwide laser industrial revolution, meaning laser technologies and what he referred to as laser-like technologies, everything from plasma industrial applications to plasma biophysics applications to particle beam applications, laser-like relativistic beam technologies. That's what he was talking about as the center of a revived productivity revolution, which would also reach and industrialize the developing sector. So clearly that got worse. That decline got worse with the crash of 2007, 2008, the great financial crash, as it's called, and the following explosion of money printing by the Federal Reserve, leading the other main central banks in response to that. Because with that dropping of interest rates to zero, or in the case of some of the central banks, below zero, holding those interest rates at effectively zero for a decade or more, depending on the central bank, but overall for more than a decade, almost all of them. At the same time, quantitative easing programs, which printed and shoveled out large amounts of new currency into the biggest banks, and only into the biggest banks, which grew immeasurably bigger during that period of time. What did that do to productivity? That clearly incentivized speculative investment as opposed to productive investment. Nothing could be clearer than that. I'm not going to try to give a detailed explanation here, of how when you provide a tremendous amount of leverage, that is debt, to an economic process or a country's economy, when you make it possible for investments to take place overwhelmingly with borrowed money, which is what this policy of zero interest rates and quantitative easing, that's what it did. When you do that, the result is that non-productive, speculative investments, all the way to the most speculative derivatives bets, become considerably more profitable than longer-term investments in productive capacity. And so the latter are not made and the former are made en masse, and the speculative bubble increases vastly. And the world debt bubble during this period of time, from the financial crash of 2008 to the present, has gone from roughly a little bit under $200 trillion. That's taking into account all forms of debt, from the governments to the local governments to the households to the businesses, a little under $200 trillion to now only a little bit under $400 trillion. That explosion of debt was accompanied by a shrinking down to virtually nothing of real physical productive investment. So that speculation rule, that was already the tendency from the 1970s, as soon as the Bretton Woods and fixed exchange rates were done away with, the gold basis was done away with, currency speculation exploded first, inflation immediately followed it. That was already the case for the 40 years before that, but then after the crash of 2008, this became absurd. And I want to show you one other thing here. As a result, these are the banks of the United States, all of them taken together, the entire U.S. banking system. This is the deposits in the banking system at 4 periods, roughly 25 years apart, overall to 25-year span, and the loans outstanding from the banking system to the economy. Now, I'm not saying these loans are all productive. Many of them were into the service economy and so on. But that's the total of loans which the banks of the U.S. banking system had made, as opposed to the deposits that they had. And you can see that in December of 1997 and in December of 2007, although there had been a great deal of growth in both, the deposits and loans were essentially equal. And in December of 2016, now 7, 8, 9 years after the crash and 7 years after the beginning of quantitative easing and flattening out into zero interest rates, all of a sudden the deposits have grown tremendously again, the loans have not. So you have banks, the banking system, and this means essentially the biggest banks, the Wall Street banks, and the big the major regional banks, filling up with deposits as a result of Federal Reserve policy, essentially, filling up with deposits, but lending far, far less. And then by December of 2021, which is now just 14, 15 months ago, the deposits are now, if you look at the growth here, there's another growth of $6.5 trillion in just those 5 years. But loans outstanding in the banking system have grown by only $1.5 trillion, as against the $6.5 trillion in deposits. So you are looking here at banks which have become essentially hedge funds, huge hedge funds, not lending institutions, and particularly not productive lending institutions. Now, this cries out for the reinstitution immediately of a Glass-Steagall Act in order to break up these biggest banks and separate all their speculative and securities units away from what is supposed to be the lending bank. And it also cries out for productive credit, because to break them up in a Glass-Steagall reorganization That's necessary, but it does not mean that they will then begin to lend to real physical productive projects, as FDR found in the New Deal. The Glass-Steagall reorganization of the banks then made things a lot healthier, but did not mean that they were going to be opening up a wide credit channel into the economy for productive investment. They didn't. Only when the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, when productive credit came from the federal government, did the banks then follow. Now, when you're looking at the banking system here with its 18 trillion in deposits now, you're essentially looking over the last 25 years, and especially since the crash, at the evolution of the U.S. economy and the decline rapidly now in its productivity. I could simply say that having looked at this, what has happened in the last year since the Federal Reserve began to suddenly reverse itself and rapidly raise interest rates is that process you just saw reversed itself. There are now $1 trillion fewer deposits in the U.S. banking system than there were in December of 2021, just a little over a year ago. And what we're seeing now in the bank crisis, as it's called, is that the Federal Reserve itself more or less announced this on Wednesday when it made its most recent increase of another quarter point in the federal funds rate, and it made another forecast for the economy, and that was discussed by the chairman Powell at his press conference afterwards, and he made very clear that now the credit is going to be squeezed to the U.S. economy for any purpose, and that lending is going to drop a good deal further. Credit is going to become very difficult, relatively speaking, as a result of the present reaction of the banking system to the sudden jacking up of interest rates. To put it very quickly, what that reaction has done is it has poured, again, quantitative easing. It has poured liquidity loans, Federal Reserve money printing back into the banks because it suddenly had bank failures to deal with and potential bigger bank failures to deal with in Europe as well as in the United States. So the Federal Reserve has done that, but that money being pumped in is going right out like a sieve from the banking system into money market funds and by the hundreds of billions and into deposits at the Federal Reserve itself. The biggest banks simply taking all this new deposits that they're getting, and they're getting them from the smaller banks. They're simply taking them and parking them at the Federal Reserve to earn a little interest and to do nothing with them. All of that is leaving the credit channel. I would estimate that some $450 billion in the last week and a half alone has left the banking system either into stale, inert deposits at the Federal Reserve by the biggest banks or into money market funds, which simply use them to buy U.S. Treasury securities. And those Treasury securities themselves have become the universal currency of speculation and are used for derivatives and other speculations. So not only is a breakup and reorganization of the banking system, as Helga LaRouche is calling for, not only is that necessary, but the other thing she insisted on for this international conference that must be held, namely a new international agreement for productive credit for large infrastructure and industrialization projects, particularly in the developing countries. That's necessary too. That is the only way in which the contraction of credit and the increasing recession for depression in the advanced economies can be reversed with a revival of productivity. So that's really what I wanted to present.
Well, thanks a lot, Paul. We're already getting various questions in the chat. We'll be getting those to you and also to Harley as soon as we get the chance. So we've got Bill Jones with us. Bill Jones, Washington correspondent for EIR, also has an important focus on the initiatives of the government of China. Most recent of this is called the Global Civilization Initiative, and the breakthrough that was recently achieved involving the nations of Iran and Saudi Arabia resuming diplomatic relations is one expression of what the Chinese have been attempting through what they call their Global Security Initiative, but also Global Civilization Initiative. These things are not even discussed, let alone understood in the United States. But in addition to this, Bill's been working on some historical precedents for this dialogue involving particularly the thinker Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz, and Bill called attention recently to the birthday that was just celebrated of the great Russian and Ukrainian scientist, Vladimir Vernadsky. So there are many different kinds of aspects, especially given Lyndon LaRouche's interest in all of this, that we think we want to bring into the discussion here. And then, as I say, there's a lot of questions, so this is going to be a very interesting afternoon. So, Bill, please.
Okay, Dennis, thank you. I'd like to just focus on the, again, the SDI anniversary, which was 2 days ago, the 40th anniversary of Reagan, which we saw in the beginning. There were probably not a lot of celebrations or discussions on it, to my knowledge, on the occasion of the anniversary, although there may have been certain things being done. Most people want to forget it. The milieu and the climate that existed at that time is much different today. And the AI is not something that a lot of people want to remember. We noticed, of course, that one of the biggest differences is that at that point, there was an extreme fear of the danger of nuclear war. Much of that has disappeared among our political elites now in regard to the situation in Ukraine. And even I'm given to believe that there are people within the institutions who are assigned to do these sorts of things, to figure out maybe how would we conduct nuclear exchanges if it does come to that in Ukraine. That situation has changed significantly. The paradigm that existed at that time, which of course was not perfect, was much more rational with regard to that. So I want to focus on that. Anybody looking back, I mean, books that are written about the SDI, however, you will never find the name of Lyndon LaRouche. I haven't seen all of the books, but I've seen a lot of them, and I know that that's generally the case. It has been erased by the official historians, who are really the epigones of those who tried to stop the SDI, even within the Reagan administration, have really won the day. And when it is taken up, many of the people who know will obsessively deny the fact that LaRouche had anything to do with this. There were two occasions of this that became notable because the involved wrote about it. One was a meeting in Moscow during the George W. Bush era, or actually George H.W. Bush era, in the year 2000, when John Bolton and Don Rumsfeld were in Moscow at a dinner with the chief of staff of the Russian military forces, Yuri Baluyevsky. And he said to them plainly, "I know who started the SDI." And they looked at him quizzically and say, well, it wasn't really one person. He says, "Yes, I know. It was Lyndon LaRouche." Of course, they denied that. They said this is all bogus. They said that Baluyevsky found that out on the internet. Now, this guy was totally into all of the intelligence in Russian GRU and KGB intelligence that was going on. He knew very well, I assume, the meetings that Lyndon LaRouche had with the Soviet representative, Mr. Shershnev, up in New York, on the issue of what the Russians should do if the president announced an SDI program. He did that. He did that again on an occasion when he was here visiting in the United States, meeting with Rumsfeld and Wolfowitz and did the same thing. Probably trying to, turn the knife a little bit, knowing that they did not want to admit this, but making sure that people generally did know this. The other thing that confirms the fact that the program of Reagan was indeed the program that LaRouche was diaries of Reagan himself, which were published some 10 years ago, in which he indicates his position on the SDI, which was much different than many of the other people in his administration. Among them were people who, like George Shultz, to the very idea of the SDI, and even within some of the military sides who didn't want this advanced laser-oriented approach. They didn't want it as a science driver. They simply wanted that kinetic kill system, which didn't advance technologies. Reagan's position was different. I'll read you just a couple of quotes. February 3rd, 1986. Then it was time for the NSC meeting in the Situation Room with regard to Gorbachev's proposal to eliminate nuclear arms. Gorbachev had indeed, in response to the SDI, said we should get rid of all nuclear arms, but he didn't want an SDI. Reagan says some wanted to tag Gorbachev's suggestion as a publicity stunt. I said, no, let's say they're all goals and now want to work out the details. If it is a publicity stunt, this will be revealed by them. I also propose, he went on, that we announce that we are going forward with SDI, but if research reveals a defense against missiles is possible, we'll work out how it can be used to protect the whole world and not just us. A little bit later that same year, June 1986, again with Caspar Weinberger, the defense secretary, he is all out for my idea of offering a treaty to the Soviets in which we offered to involve them in any testing of SDI. You should also note here that in 1984, I believe Lyndon LaRouche published the text of what 80 on SDI would actually look like. Reagan continued, if research develops that our anti-nuclear missile defense is practical, share the system if all agree to eliminate ICBMs. Later on, the next year, February of '87, he went even further, and he says, I have prepared a plan to seek an agreement that will, when and if SDI is ready for deployment, put it in hands of an international force as a defense against any and all nuclear missiles from wherever they are launched in the world. Later on that same 19, as the SDI was undermined from within in terms of the people who didn't want this advanced technology side of it. He notes that one of his advisors, Frank Carlucci, is pushing a plan to put third phase of SDI in place before going any further on 1 and 2. Now, the third phase was a simple defense from the ground using large and not necessarily lasers, and would eliminate the whole space-based laser approach, which meant that you could eliminate other missiles in flight shortly after they took off. So that's of course the way that the thing developed. That SDI then became this system of simply developing a kinetic kill system, and the whole purpose of this was then lost. In spite of the fact, even during the coming years in the 1990s, during the Clinton period, the idea of sharing and cooperating with this then Russia, the new Russia collapsed in 1989, that there was still this coalition that was being discussed between the two governments, in which Lyndon LaRouche was very much involved. Now, you got to remember the fact that because of his exposure as the author of the SDI to the general public, nobody else had ever mentioned this in public fora except for Lyndon LaRouche until Reagan made his announcement. At that time, people freaked out, said LaRouche has got the ear of the president, he's got to be stopped. And a task force was set into motion, similar to what we're hearing about the FBI operations today. They were already in motion in those days against political opponents who were not deemed acceptable by the military-industrial complex, to try and stop them, throw them in jail, and possibly even kill them. And that attack was launched, and LaRouche, as a result of that, on trumped-up charges, was given a prison sentence and spent 5 years in jail. This was during the Bush administration. When President Clinton came, aware of the fact that LaRouche had been railroaded, he was given, granted a parole. He was up for parole. It was granted. But the unusual thing is that he was allowed, as a parolee, who must report to the parole officer if you want to go from Virginia to Washington, D.C., he was allowed to go scout, to talk to scholars over there, including at the Russian Academy of Sciences, as a part of what was effectively a second track of the Clinton administration in trying to develop a policy with this new Yeltsin government that had come into power. And even in the 1990s, there was a practical cooperation. There were Russian officers in Colorado Springs trying to develop a similar program called the Trust or the Ramos program. So that was continuing largely on the advice of what LaRouche had said initially. Nevertheless, this was undermined during the Clinton administration by the fact that he had placed Al Gore in charge of Russia policy at a certain point. And the so-called Gore-Chernomyrdin Commission was then responsible for U.S.-Russian relationships, and everything went to hell in a handbasket. And economically for Russia, which was being turned into a banana republic, the venture capital was then allowed to move into Russia to buy up Russian resources dirt cheap. Many of these old bureaucrats in the Soviet bureaucracy then suddenly became capitalists and realized they could make a lot more money out of capitalism, and they also became venture capitalists. And the country went to hell in a handbasket. If you visited Moscow in 1993, 94, you would see people going out into the parks to pick mushrooms. This was generally something that the Russians do, but they were doing that because they needed food. And this was their only source of food. You went into the subway stations in Moscow, and you would see that people were taking all of their valuables and setting up, selling them, including their, in order to get money to survive. These 10 years of capitalism during the Yeltsin period created more devastation, people say, than 70 years of the Soviet communism. And at a certain point, this was leading to total chaos. Problem was that although there had been a good rapport between President Clinton and President Yeltsin had a big drinking problem. And unfortunately, that was used kind of to manipulate him to accept things that really were not in his national interest, including the introduction of massive venture capitalism, so-called shock therapy, which the economy. This was changed, was being treated and being transformed into a veritable banana republic by this policy. And it was only changed by the, I think, important decision of Yeltsin, maybe on the advice of his daughter, didn't have a drinking problem, and was Yeltsin's chief advisor in many respects, that Vladimir Putin was called in to assist with the situation. And Putin, of course, had a different view of things on how Russia had to be revived. He adopted, to a large extent, I would say, the position of Peter the Great, who was also the modernizer of modern Russia in the 17th century. And Peter, in order to gain control over all the little power sectors within this country, led by the so-called boyars, or the landowners, and the military forces the leaders of the military forces in a very disparate type of military situation. He had to bring them. To toe the line. So he bearded the boyars. The boyars had big beards, and he introduced a beard tax, and that if you had a beard, you had to pay a tax. But he would actually cut the beards of the boyars, so that they didn't have to pay these. He would go out on the streets and finding people with the beards, and they would cut their beards. This also, of course, disarmed the boyars, because much of their power, was in their personal appearance, and the beard probably had some important element of power, and that was eliminated as soon as they became either clean-shaven or eliminated from part of their beard. But that created a situation in which we are no longer a country which is divided into a number of little groups of landlords or landowners who are determining policy on their own, trying to find a compromise. We're moving in the direction of making this country, this backward nation, into a major industrial power by introducing technology. People maybe know the story of him traveling to Europe to learn, up to Holland, to learn shipbuilding. Putin did the same thing. He bearded the oligarchs who had taken over in there. Obviously, a number of compromises were made, but the principle was established that we are one nation, must move in the direction of bringing together our industrial power and eliminating all this speculation which is going on, which is destroying the country and destroying our population. In many respects, I see this as Putin reviving Peter's policy. But you have to understand that Peter's policy came out of the head of one man in many respects, and that was Gottfried Leibniz, a librarian in Brunswick, who was probably the most intelligent figure in his time. He was something of a universal genius in many, many different fields: mathematician, physics, economy. But he was really working as a small figure in this library in Brunswick, but his vision encompassed the entire world. And looking around at the world, he said he saw the great expanses still unexplored in Russia, moving to the east, moving towards the Pacific, and moving towards China, which Leibniz was quite aware of through his contacts and his correspondence with many of these who were missionaries at the time. And he succeeded in getting contact with Peter as he was coming to his European tours to present to him Leibniz's ideas of what Peter should do to turn Russia into a major country, a major modern country. And part of these ideas were, first of all, the establishment of an Academy of Sciences, which Leibniz had already done in Germany. And he said to Peter, one of the main tasks must be that you must move eastward. You must find out what the limits, what the expanses of your nation are, all the way to the Pacific coast. And you must consider that what you have are a country that's relatively backward, but which is surrounded by two major cultures. One, of course, is the culture in the West, and one culture in the East, in particular the advanced culture in China. And if you can link up to these, you can more quickly develop your nation into a major power. And indeed, that's what Peter did. He set up an Academy of Sciences, and the first task that he set them, which was a multi-generational task, was to move out to the eastern part of the wilderness, or the expanses of Siberia, all the way to the Pacific coast, to find, among other things, as Leibniz wanted to know, if there was a land connection to America from Asia, bringing that also, encompassing that also in his world vision in Leibniz's world vision. And this indeed is what Peter did. He established this in order to create a situation in which Russia would then become a major fulcrum between East and West. And of course, he had people already in China who were writing back to him about the situation that existed in the country at that time. So what you see in this Xi-Putin meeting is a lot more than simply, two countries coming together in a comprehensive strategic relationship, as they call it. It's not simply the meeting of, as the Western propaganda has it, brothers, very close relationship, but it's a relationship that has existed for a very long time and only was broken for a short period, for a hiatus of maybe a decade, a little more than a decade and more, during the so-called Sino-Soviet split. Prior to that, the People's Republic of China and the Soviet Union had very close relations, and much of the science that was introduced into the People's Republic at that time was done by Soviet engineers and scientists who came to China to work. The unfortunate conflict, which was partially political and personal, between Mao Zedong and Khrushchev, broke that relationship, causing a lot of devastation in China and, at least for a time, bad feelings. But the long term, the longer view of this never really disappeared. And it has been revived, especially revived under President Xi Jinping. Russia was the first country that Xi Jinping visited after he came into power in 2012. It was the first country he wanted to make a statement that we are each other's biggest neighbors, and we are going to establish a relationship of solid and firm friendship and cooperation levels. Since that time, I think they have had personal meetings, 41 personal meetings during that 10-year period. And what you had last February had a declaration that freaked out the West, because they said that our relationship is not an alliance, but it's much more than that. It's much greater than that. President Xi, in his comments when he went to Moscow, also referred not only to the last 10 years, but it referred to the relationship for the last 70 years, since the foundation of the People's Republic of China, indicating that the view is not that this is some form of temporary relationship or some form of relationship which has to do with the immediate political situation that exists, in which Russia and China are targeted by the West, but it is a reaffirmation of the Leibnizian vision, effectively, that Russia and China are the major power, the major expanse of the Eurasian. And I would also include in that India, which is not a part of this alliance against them, has a very close relationship with Russia, difficulties with China, but some of these things are being mended, but they also will be a part of this. But the expanse of these two major countries, which Leibniz saw, that the world he envisioned as a world of common destiny, can only benefit to the extent that the major powers, and he saw Russia because of its expanse rather than because of its economic potential at that time as a major power, and he saw China as a major power because of the advancement of its own culture, which hadn't kept pace with the last 50 years of development, but had kept pace fairly well with the last 5,000 years. In fact, was probably one of the most advanced cultures of its time. If they could get together, there could be a unity that could have world-shaking significance. And he also saw, of course, that whether or not Asia were connected to America, that would have implications for bringing the American continent into this community of common destiny. So I think the way we look at this is in terms of the longer view, that this is something that has been in motion for much longer even than 70 years. And it's now a culmination. It's, I think, an inseparable development. It's not going to be pulled apart. As a matter of fact, because of the very tense situation, economic and political situation, and the danger of nuclear war, this has become a point of harmony in a disharmonious world. And this is why you're having all the support you're coming out of the global south, countries of Africa, Asia, Latin America, you know, the neighborhood of the United States, which the United States has helped to, you know, devastate through its economic policy, are now looking to China and also looking to Russia and to the configuration that they represent as an alternative to a world which is physically and financially falling apart. And I think this is the only way we should see this. I mean, this is something that is bigger than anything that we can imagine. It's a reassertion of a major grouping of countries which can push the world forward. The difference you have today is that Russia is not the Russia of Peter's time. It is a very well-developed country. In issues of basic science, it still remains really number one in many fields. Even during the Soviet period, what Paul was talking about of laser and electromagnetic pulse, fusion energy, thermonuclear fusion energy, which is now being talked about more widely, these had their origins in Soviet science, and that remains the case. China, on the other hand, of course, is the real engine, the motor of the world economy. And they can bring to bear their efforts to develop and to work together with that big potential in Russia to create the physical basis for reviving the world economy. And you have to remember that much of this is focused on the far east of Russia, under which lie all of the elements of Mendeleev's periodic table. And it was clear in the recent statements, the economic statements made at the Moscow meeting, that there will be a lot of mining, a lot of resource looking work in metallurgy and the like. And I think there'll be a lot more activity within the Siberian portions of Russia, which still need a great deal of development in order to utilize the mineral and other resources there to try and feed the world. Farming is going to be a big thing to provide the material goods that the world needs. And looking back at the period of Leibniz, or the figure of Leibniz, you have to draw the same conclusions. You have to have the same mindset. That Leibniz was what he would call the individual or the monad, the microcosm, a simple microcosm located, you know, geographically in a small part of the state of Brunswick in Germany, with of course networks throughout the world, but whose mind has encompassed the macrocosm. And as a result of that microcosm, through its own individual activity, was able to begin to shape and to develop the macrocosm. Because that's really our position now today. The world that we have in the US and Europe, it's going into a chaotic situation. NATO is a colossus with feet of clay. Economically, they're sending military weapons all over the world, and they no longer have the ability to produce what they even felt they needed for their own defense. And then, of course, this economic crisis, this is going to be, the floodgates are going to be open. So you have that contrast between a population in Europe and the United States seeking guidance, seeking pathway than the one that has been traveled up until now. And you have the study, which is being brought about by the Chinese cooperation as a part of the global majority, gives you as the microcosm with our or your limited resources, the ability to affect changes on the macrocosm. And that's really the task at hand now. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Bill. And what I guess I want to do here is a couple of things. There are several questions, and some of them are very particular, very specific. But first, give both Harley and Paul a chance to say anything, if there's anything they want to say in response to one another or other matters that haven't been taken up. So, Harley, let me go to you first, and then to Paul.
Well, in thinking about the topic for today, it really did require going back through literally the last 50 years. I mean, for me, it's a personal journey. I met Lyndon LaRouche in 1972. And as you look at these milestones, the International Development Bank, the SDI, the various forecasts, what you see is that this has been, Lynn was an extraordinary person from the standpoint of unifying the ideas in science, in physical economy, in arts and culture, and being able to make his forecast based on that interrelated dynamic. And if you look at people who are making policy today, and of course Biden is a horrible example, but you look at people like Blinken, you look at Sullivan, you look at Macron. What we see are literally people whose heads are filled with soup and mush compared to what's necessary at this moment. And I think the report we just heard from Bill is quite interesting in terms of this centuries-long development of these concepts going back to Leibniz. So, when people ask, well, what do we do? What's the simple solution? There's no simple solution. You really have to immerse yourself in this higher geometry of statecraft and science. And I think that's what Lyndon LaRouche bequeathed to all of us. And that's the solution that's where the solution to these crises lie.
Okay, thanks. Paul?
Well, intermediate range missiles and nuclear missiles and short range missiles are really the worst. They were the driver of both of the crises, 1962 Cuban Missile Crisis and the 1982 so-called Euro Missiles Crisis, when in both times millions of people were shocked into the realization that nuclear war could be about to happen right then on them. And I know, having a memory of both of those, in the first one being just a 17-year-old teenager with not any way to deal with the situation at all, except just to wait and see what would happen with the Cuban Missile Crisis. My reaction was, like many others, was terror, scared. Whereas in the 1982 crisis, where again nuclear war was close, these short-range missiles, which could hit their targets in a few minutes, had been put in place both from the NATO side. In Germany, they already existed in the UK and France, and they had been put in place from the Soviet side, the SS-20s, and their deployments were being increased. It was so close that, again, millions of people were out. They were demonstrating. They were scared. But at that time, because of being active in what Lyndon LaRouche was trying to do from late 1970s onward in getting this policy of strategic defense, beam weapon defense, getting it implemented and coming close enough to that. We knew we had a shot at it. That being active in that way meant that that crisis was much less of an emotional shock. It put your emotions in a much better direction in trying to solve it. And Lyndon LaRouche, having built that movement by that time, which had a solution, and in fact, that the emergence of this strategic defense initiative and Reagan's pushing of it as far as it went did lead to the 1977 Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty, which banned these land-based short-range nuclear missiles on both sides. That's a treaty which has now been essentially scrapped, first by the United States, now been compliance with it also ended from the Russian side. But that really was a difference in the two. I wanted to ask Bill, in listening to his presentation, if he would say that these diaries of Ronald Reagan indicated that Reagan kept consistent in his presidency to the idea of developing anti-missile laser-like technologies and then sharing them with the Soviet Union. Because if he did, then that's really a very strong indication. The people who later claimed that it was not LaRouche, no, it was High Frontier or something else that Reagan adopted, their plans for anti-missile defense were explicitly to be secret and unilateral on the part of the United States and kept from any knowledge, any working knowledge on the part of the Soviet Union.
Bill, you want to respond to that?
Yeah. Look, I think he never gave up on that. It's my impression. I look at diaries, look at later entries. The one that I mentioned was 1999, and that was relatively late. Talked about Carlucci, trying to digital the real key part of the SDI. And I think that was also that he had the same idea since he was intent on developing part one and part two. Then obviously the idea was absolutely essential for him, and it was only when they abandoned that it was no longer necessary. I'm not sure what he had. I think he personally did want it. I think it was dismantled, probably financially. He indicated in the quotes about Carlucci that Congress had to give money to the program. And we know what Congress was like at that time and their position on that. And that's probably what killed it more than anything else. But I think he was determined to do that. And I think the people agreement with that. Caspar Weinberger, we know from other sources that he was more detailed than Reagan in his speech to the Soviets with regard to what they could expect in terms of cooperation. And there's also the story that I think has some reality to it, is that Edward Teller, who also was in favor of this, who was Reagan's advisor. Reagan even mentions, Teller was in today, and he talked about this new plan that, and sounds very good to me, that he was also in favor of that, and he was to give assurances to Yevgeny Velikov, who came over, was a science advisor to Gorbachev, who came over to investigate whether or not this program was really the thing LaRouche had been talking about, or if it was something different than that. And Teller assured him that a program in which it would be shared with the Soviet Union, and he even made a promise, according to certain sources, that he would tell her to give assurances to the Russians that the offer was sincere. He tell her would go to help them build a tokamak. Both Teller and Velikov were also in the thermonuclear fusion program. And Velikov himself said to me at one point, much later on, in 2000 or something, when he was visiting here up at the Woodrow Wilson Center, that the problem was why the Soviets did not accept this was that they did not believe that the offer was sincere. And Velikov said, I didn't believe her until I finally met Reagan and realized that he was sincere. So I don't think it gave up. It was destroyed from within his administration, from within the Congress on the funding side.
Okay, now we have a lot of questions, and I think what we're going to have to do is, because you'll see by the nature of them, some of them are rather important. I'm going to ask one of you to answer, and then if others of you have something to say, I think the way I'll do it is to pose a second question, but if you wish to add something at that point, go right ahead. So there's the first one. This is for you, Harley, and this is 2 or 3 questions put into one, but they pertain to the March 23rd attempt by U.S. Senator Rand Paul to have the Senate repeal the 2001 authorization for the use of military force that was done at the time of 9/11, the basis for many other actions, including, for example, the October invasion of Afghanistan, October 7th of 2001. So here's what was said by Senator Paul. He lost the resolution. The vote was 86-9. He said the following: today I offered the United States Senate a chance to repeal the 9/11-2001 authorization for war, to reclaim our constitutional power and send a message to the world that we are a nation of peace. That when we are provoked to war, the gentle giant that is America will respond lawfully according to the Constitution. That when war is absolutely necessary, America will obey the Constitution, which requires us to debate and vote upon war and not hide beneath another generation's deliberations. Today, we should have risen above symbolism and repealed the 9/11 authorization for war and shown our respect for the Constitution, our fealty to the rule of law, and our sincere desire that peace, not perpetual war, be our legacy. So that's what he had to say at the conclusion of the vote, which lost. And so everybody is clear, it means that the United States, since that time, since 2001, has been operating with a de facto application of the Constitution in favor of allowing for the executive branch to conduct actions of war without votes. So, Harley, can you just respond to what we think and what you think about that?
Well, the obvious point that Paul was making, Rand Paul was making, is that the Constitution has a specific approach to war fighting. Who makes war? Who decides? And what we know is that you have a lot of discussion that goes on behind the scenes where they say, well, we can't wait and have a debate in the modern period of time where war decisions are split second. They could be split second, and you do have to allow a certain leeway for the commander-in-chief to make decisions. Now, that has nothing to do with the 2001 authorization to use military force still being in existence today. Even at the time, it was not urgent that there be an operation launched to go into Afghanistan. There had been no investigation, no serious investigation into what happened, what was behind 9/11. There are many questions that have been raised since then. So I think the question that it has to be posed is, why would members of the Senate today be so insistent to stick with that policy from more than 20 years ago, which has led to one disaster after another. And especially when you look at the current occupant in the White House, who's never been opposed to these wars, who's pushing for another war where the American people have no say and where over $100 billion is going. You know, the fact that we're supposed to be the Senate is supposed to be the world's leading deliberative body. And what we see is an absolute paucity of thinking and deliberation. And you know that is what's worrying the whole world. And so I think whether that's well known or not around the rest of the world, what's clear is that the rest of the world, the so-called global majority, as Lavrov has been calling it, no longer has any confidence or trust in the United States. It's not just Putin who said, how can we trust the West? Much of the world has that same view. And you cannot have a world of peace and cooperation when that kind of arbitrary policy is the dominant, is the basis of the US decision whether to go to war or not. So I think it was a moment of opportunity. The fact that so few senators took the opportunity to do something about this, even as I think many people know, the discussion about the 20th anniversary of the invasion of Iraq, well, there were some people like Thomas Friedman and John Bolton who continued to say it was the right decision. Most commentators said it was a wrong decision. And I think if you look at the wars we've been in, you'd have the same reaction from many people. So why continue the policy that put us into these permanent wars? So I think it was an opportunity that was lost by the Senate.
All right. Now, we've got a couple of questions which I'm going to give you, Paul. One is from Rosetta. And the question is, could a version of the SDI be proposed or implemented today? Given the state of the U.S. economy, it's questionable that it could mobilize the resources necessary. And I'll just add, you might want to say something about what the state of the U.S. economy is with that regard. The second question, which is from Kynan, which I think goes with that, was, could you go into more detail about the technological spin-offs from the Strategic Defense Initiative? You mentioned that LaRouche was not only focused on missile defense, but creating a laser industrial revolution, and you mentioned terms like plasma biophysics, particle beam applications, and so forth. Can you elaborate on these various applications? Those are the two questions.
You're muted.
Yeah, okay.
Now we hear you.
I was warned that I was muted. The policy obviously could be reestablished as a policy. It would be difficult to implement. The offensive missile technologies, especially with the hyper-fast, hypersonic technologies for missiles, which the Russians really have been first to develop them such that they are actually using them in the present conflict and producing quite a lot of them, whereas the United States is still testing one. Now, that should give an idea of the difficulty that such a policy would have if there were an attempt by the United States to implement a strategic defense initiative. In addition to that, it would have to be international. It would have to be agreed on among roughly the same major powers, at least the same four major powers that Harley discussed in the beginning, and hopefully others. And it would include strategic defense of Earth, as it was called when that proposal was first made from the Russian side. That is, capability to use directed relativistic beam devices in order to stop extraterrestrial objects from hitting the Earth, and do it in a relatively quick way, as we saw with the recent DART experiment. Although it was successful, that required that these two asteroids' course be known long in advance, that a great deal be known about them well in advance before there was any actual changing of their trajectory if it were toward the Earth. So these things have really lagged. They could only be done internationally. I'll give you one idea. The Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development statistics put out an estimate, this is now in late 2021, that the total investment in laser and laser industrial technologies in Asia exceeded the total investment in the United States and Europe combined by about 7 trillion to 5.5 trillion. Now, considering this is over a very long period of time, nearly half a century that they're considering, and that in the early parts of that period, the Asian countries involved were developing countries, with the exception of Japan. So one would not expect, or another way to put it, it's not that the 7 trillion among the Asian countries in laser industrial technologies represents a huge amount, but rather that the 5.5 trillion on the part of the US and European countries represents a pretty small amount over such a long period of time. By comparison, in the 21st century, the annual investment in the fossil fuel technologies, including recovering them, discovering them, refining them, and so on, those investments were running in the range of $8 to $10 trillion in each decade, not over a half-century period of time, but in each decade, investments on that scale were being made. That was until the Green New Deal hit. That's definitely not the case anymore. But it gives you an idea that this whole area of frontier technologies, and therefore of a surge in productivity that LaRouche was talking about across the industrial spectrum as well as militarily, that didn't occur. The opposite of that occurred. You saw the graphs that I showed earlier. It would be difficult to recover that kind of development, that pace of development now, and absolutely would have to involve 4, 5, half a dozen major spacefaring powers. Notice also that LaRouche kept describing in that quote that we heard and then that I read, this as essentially a facet of the Moon or Moon-Mars exploration project, coming from the Apollo project of the Kennedy years, so that it would also have to involve all those spacefaring nations, and in cooperation, absolutely. That's why I brought up the question to Bill that about the diaries, because it was the red dye that distinguished Lyndon LaRouche's proposal from Ersatz things that were claimed to be the SDI later. That red dye was the offer of cooperation to the Soviet Union in developing these beam weapons. Now it would have to be significantly broader than that. And at that time, LaRouche spoke all over Europe and in Japan to large audiences, including a lot of military people in each of those places and industrial people, about the fact that this had to be done as an international cooperative effort. So yes, that's how it could be done. As far as what kind of was asking, that's it takes. I wrote this up maybe a year ago. That takes a lot of time to go into, but there are plasma technologies which have been developed, at least to one degree or another, plasma industrial and biophysics technologies in the entire range from the hundreds of millions of degrees Kelvin, where fusion energy reactions are attempting to get, in one case have gotten past the break-even point, all the way down to room temperature plasma applications, and even cooler than that, which tend to be in the biomedical and biomedical diagnostic area. One that was very famous that came directly from the SDI itself was the X-ray laser, which is a medical diagnostic revolution, really, and which the very idea of it almost didn't exist until the development in DARPA in the SDI. So there are a lot of such things.
Okay, so Bill, we have a clip from former Australian Prime Minister Paul Keating refuting the idea that China is a threat to the United States. We want to get a comment from you on that, and then I have a question in addition after that. So if we can play that.
Okay.
Underlying all this stuff about the need of nuclear power is the idea that China has either threatened us or will threaten us. Now, this is a distortion and it's untrue. China does not threaten the United States. Nobody can threaten the United States. It's got 10,000 kilometres of sea between the Chinese coast and California. It's got the Atlantic Ocean on the other side. It has a massive country with in space, in land mass, and friends in Canada on the north and Mexico on the south, and the greatest armaments in all history. China.
So the question is, why is this discussion around this AUKUS business particularly, and the idea of gearing up the United States to fight China? What is that all about?
Well, let me just reiterate what Paul Keating said, and that is that China is no threat to the United States. Mentioning Plugger's comments on the a possibility of SDI today, or agreement today, it would have to include China, because although they do not have the same extent of military technology and the amount of nuclear weapons that either the Russia or the United States possess, their rate of development is probably much more rapid in this field as in many other fields for their own defensive reasons. I think the only conflict that it has with China, which would be regarded by the Chinese as a conflict, is the situation in Taiwan. I cannot see them going to war really with anybody except this issue of Taiwan independence becomes a reality, or the U.S. tries to, bring Taiwan into this forces. For the following reason, that the object of what China is trying to do, this notion of rejuvenation, another term they made, rejuvenation is what they call it, or what they call Chinese modernization, is that the model of modernization that China is proposing is more beneficial to its general population because it is all-encompassing of that population. And that requires a number of things. It requires continued peace and stability, continued economic development, continuing development of science and technology, and also enhancing the diplomatic proposals by China to improve global governance. That's their sense of identity. And anything that disturbs that, even, of course, a war over Taiwan, which could very well develop if the United States moves to try and separate Taiwan from China, would disrupt the general orientation of what they are moving towards. And they don't want that to happen. And you see that in the reaction to the war in Ukraine. They understand clearly the reasoning behind Russia's decision to go to war, but they're not especially happy with it. And I don't think they were informed ahead of time that this was to happen. And when it did happen, they did not rush to say what you need. They find a pathway to peace in the world, because that's the only way that they can move forward on the program that they have laid out, most recently at the 20th Party Congress. And there is a unity around that program. There is a unity that China will be playing a major role, not as a hegemon, not as a new aggressor, but as a model, as a better model for developing your population, which doesn't leave anybody behind. And that's really what they're doing, and that's why they are no threat to the United States. They will continue to modern their military for reasons that they feel that they are living in a very aversive environment regionally, with Japan, with the AUKUS situation in particular, the introduction of nuclear-powered submarines floating around out the Chinese coast is a very threatening situation, and they will take measures, whatever measures necessary, to have the ability to counter that if that ever led to a military conflict, if the West initiated something in the way of capturing Taiwan or even launching some kind of a nuclear attack. We have been the aggressors for most of since the foundation of the People's Republic of China. They had their arguments with the Soviet Union on how they would look under, world socialism and things like terms, even of the Korean War. That was not started by China. I mean, that was a conflict that was really kind of provoked by the U.S. and to a certain extent with the green light from Stalin, in which the Chinese felt they had to get involved because it was really on their borders. But they don't have a history of that. And the only problem fundamentally they have with the United States is this idea of containment, especially containment, which brings in Taiwan, an element of the containment.
Okay, thanks a lot, Bill. And we're having a bit of a technical problem with your site. Jose, or whomever was doing the video, see if there's something we can do about that. Just there was a comment about what you were saying as you were talking from Debashis. Just said, such a waste of intelligence, production, and scientific potential. We could transform this world if we worked together. Look at the fruits of the International Space Station. That was just the comment that came in as you were talking. Paul, Harley, this is a question and asking for a comment about Brazil's President Lula, who was on his way to China and slightly delayed because of an illness, but should be arriving on March 26th. And in an interview that he gave yesterday, he said, "We are very interested in promoting or helping to generate some kind of meeting that would lead to a peace process, particularly pertaining to Ukraine. The president has said so many times he hears a lot about war, but very few words about peace. And he is very interested in peace conversations." That was essentially a spokesman for Lula speaking. And so this sort of the question, just to sort of paraphrase, is since there was the Chinese proposal for peace, there is motion that we've seen that's been successful by the Chinese in the area of diplomacy, and now Lula of Brazil is showing up. What would have to happen for there to be some movement toward what Helga has described in terms of an international conference to promote this?
Well, Lula previously had made a statement that he would be willing to act as a mediator. This was following the initiative from the Vatican, which we had supported, the idea that the Vatican could be a venue for peace talks with no preconditions. Lula made his own statement on this, and then you had the Chinese, the principles the Chinese put forward as the basis of a peace plan. And then, of course, you also have the fundamental principles that were drafted by Helga LaRouche. And what most of them have in common is this idea of respect for sovereignty, and that the legitimate security concerns of the other must be taken as the basis for relations. But I think the question of a ceasefire, what could Lula and Xi Jinping do? Well, the problem is, at this point, the United States and NATO. The US and NATO have no intention of stopping this war, even though the war is a disaster for the people of Ukraine. It's created difficulties for the people of Russia, but it's had a boomerang effect with the sanctions and everything else on the United States and Europe. So, the question that has to be posed here is, what would the US do if Lula and the Chinese came forward with a more detailed plan for ending the fighting? And I think this is something that probably Xi Jinping discussed with Putin. So the problem rests with the West. And the one positive development we've seen is the growing anger and opposition of the people in the NATO countries to a continuation of the war. With some say 2 to 3 million people in the streets of France. It's a pension issue, but it's also economic. It's EU. It's the war. Big farm demonstration in Holland. The 50,000 people at the Brandenburg Gate in Berlin. The alliance between the Libertarians and the People's Party behind the February 19th demonstration in the United States. I think if anything is going to come of this, and of course, let me just say, Zelensky also said he's interested in talking to China about this. Well, is there a possibility that he would break from NATO? I don't think so. But I think the key question, we'll see what happens when Lula and Xi Jinping meet, what the proposal might be. But ultimately, it's going to require a push from the West. And that means from the people, because the Congress, the political leaders, nations are divided. The coalition governments in Europe are weak. In Germany, it's a very weak coalition. So there's a possibility that not a possibility, there's a necessity that the voice of the people be heard if there's going to be any progress. And we'll see what Lula and Xi Jinping come up with. But I think ultimately we're going to have to do some work to bring about peace here.
Okay, and we've got sort of a final question which we'll push to everybody. There have been a couple of other remarks. I just referenced them. Someone, David, wrote saying the U.S. incrementally increasing the number of U.S. troops on Taiwan is very, very dangerous. We make the mistake of basing tactical nukes in Taiwan. I wonder if China will be forced to take action. Let me just be clear with people that talking about having U.S. presence in Taiwan is like having Chinese presence in Hawaii. So, no, you are not going to get to the point of putting tactical nuclear weapons anywhere near Taiwan. I just wanted that to be cleared so we keep a perspective. And otherwise, someone, Ari, wrote, the U.S. should be at the forefront of peacemaking globally. We are missing great opportunities. Is it too late? So I want to just get to this final question for everyone from Missy. And the question is, my question would be, how does a people arrest their government, which has gone rogue and is trying to spark nuclear war? How do you deal with that? I know we don't even have our own military, so what do we do? So that's the. I figured everybody might have thoughts about that situation. So, and certainly some of us appreciate the sense of frustration that goes with it. So, Paul, let me go to you first on that.
Well, maybe you scare everybody to death with the government's actions bring about a collapse of all the banks, and you know, that certainly scares people more than anything else, quicker than anything else. Maybe not for the right reasons, but it certainly gets their attention. So let's say you get mobilizing for a Glass-Steagall breakup of those banks and reorganization, and for a credit agreement among major nations in order to develop and industrialize developing countries. Let's say you get mobilizing for that, and you kind of let the Federal Reserve do the rest.
Okay. Bill, what do you think's thoughts about that? Your actual thoughts about that?
What I would say is you have to kind of think yourself as the microcosm in a macrocosm. The macrocosm being a mass strike process. The world around you that is collapsing. Alternatives immediately in the so-called powers that be, or the institute be. You've got to initiate some kind of a focal point which people can organize around. And in fact, you know, the work of the Schiller Institute has been to do exactly that. The fact that we've had these conferences, you know, at very regular and frequent intervals, has a cumulative effect. And we see that, of course, in, you know, the coverage in the Chinese and in the Russian press of what she's been saying. And of course, you go back to, you know, what Lyndon LaRouche did in organizing what was, I can remember 150 people in a room, you know, talking about, you know, changing the world, industrializing the third world. You know, what were we? You know, I mean, in magnitude, it was actually absolutely. But in terms of the situation that was developing, it was a tremendous potential. And I think that the key is that that this situation is going to go from bad to worse. It will be a mass strike process. We'll probably see more of what we're seeing most visibly in Europe. And to the extent that we can continue to make our voice heard, to be a visible force, then anything happen at a moment in which people see no other, much of the, you know, the garbage and the organizing and everything else that we see here kind of flakes away in the overall chaos. It can develop into total chaos and the country can go to hell in a handbasket, but to the extent that there's something there, that there's this process which is connected to a global process which represents the global majority, you've got a chance of people to a more rational solution. That can have effect in many different ways. It can have effects even in this crazy Congress we have. Diane's campaign, I think, already has created waves of that respect, and that there are people who, as they become, you know, more and more desperate, the craziness around them, will take a look at the one voice of reason, which is spreading, and that is really our work. I mean, that's what I say about this.
All right, very good. Harley, do we have him there?
Well, yeah. Let me go back to what Paul was talking about, the relationship between the economic crisis and the war threat. You know, we've been insisting from the beginning that this situation in Ukraine has nothing to do with Putin's aggression towards Europe. It has nothing to do with freedom and sovereignty for Ukraine. That was taken away with the Maidan coup in 2014. The war in Ukraine has to do with the fear that as the Western economic model, the so-called one model fits all, the rules-based order, that it's collapsing, and that there would be an emergence of an alternative. And this is something that Lyndon LaRouche fought for many, many years, with the idea that if the United States became part of that alternative, it would be very easy. The idea of the four powers is that you need countries that are strong enough to stand up to the economic blackmail of the City of London and Wall Street, which represent the major force in this whole imperial system, this so-called unipolar system. So we're seeing that emerge now. Now, the point we have to make to the American people and the people of Western Europe is that Russia and China are not the enemy, that what they're trying to do with their economies, with their countries, with the Belt and Road Initiative, is a model for not just the rest of the world, the so-called global majority that's emerging, but for the Western countries. We've given up our economic model. We've become a nation addicted to entertainment, recreation, drugs, momentary impulses on social media, and lost the ability to think in the long term. And that's why we're crashing. But that's not, as was pointed out by both Paul and Bill, the ideas that LaRouche introduced with the science and technology of the SDI are a pathway to the future. And this is the direction that's being taken by our so-called enemies, Russia and China. While our governments and our institutions, such as the State Department, the Federal Reserve, the financial system, and the media, are losing credibility with the people in the Western countries. So I think we just have to escalate our fight for an honest debate and dialogue. And that's what we do with our conferences. And people should join us. They should become part of our mobilization, should take some inspiration from people like Kynan and Jose and Diane Sayre, who are courageous enough to speak power or speak truth to power. Ray McGovern's another example of that. I think the examples are there. It's just a question of sticking to a program that will work. And that's why the economic approach is so important. The economic development is the name for peace. So I think that's the message we have to communicate. Whether we can overcome the pessimism that's been built in because of the years of brainwashing by media and so on, that's the real question. And the only way to break that is by courageous examples.
All right, so I want to thank Harley Schlanger, Paul Gallagher, and Bill Jones for being with us today. I think we've covered a lot. And I also want to just point out for people that Harley referenced the upcoming conference, implicitly referenced the upcoming conference, Saturday, April 15th. Without the development of all nations, there can be no lasting peace on the planet. We want you all to join that conference, help organize it, and participate in it. And also call your attention to Helga Sepp-LaRouche's call for an international emergency conference to reorganize the bankrupt financial system. As we come to a close, let me just say my own response to the question, which I'd like to pose again, which was, how does a people arrest their government, which has gone rogue and is trying to spark nuclear war? How do we deal with this? That was exactly what Lyndon LaRouche did 40 years ago. But the way that you arrest the government is that you have to do it intellectually. You have to find a flank. You have to find an idea, which is an area of the mind that your enemy doesn't know even exists. Now, generally speaking, that's not that hard because most of the people who are opposed to us are not creative. They're simply venal, feral, and they have a lot of money and other resources. But that's exactly what he did with this question of the SDI. In fact, in the moments after Ronald Reagan concluded his speech, for about 24 to 48 hours afterwards, virtually everyone in his cabinet was either completely speechless or were saying things that were unprintable, along with people like Henry Kissinger and others, because nobody knew where this had come from. In fact, Paul Gallagher found himself, back then there was only three major networks, ABC, NBC, CBS. He found himself as executive director of the Fusion Energy Foundation giving interviews because nobody knew what Reagan was talking about. And consequently, by default, there we were. And so they were arrested. They were arrested in the sense that they were transfixed, they were paralyzed, they had nothing to say. And it's in this realm of ideas, which Lyndon LaRouche most clearly exemplified, that that the solution really exists. I'd less like to say in closing, before we again show Lyndon LaRouche's video, which we showed at the beginning, here's an example of this. Here's a document called Saudi Arabia in the Year 2023. And if you look at there to the right, on the right of your screen, you see the date, June 1983. And if you were to read that document, you'll see that Lyndon LaRouche 40 years ago, he wasn't thinking about the Saudi government per se, or the particular problems of the factions and so on. He was looking at the issue of Southwest Asia and the relationship of all of the nations, what was then called the Arab world, Arabic-speaking world. How you would get, what would be the development policies and prospects. And this was at the same time as he was doing the Strategic Defense Initiative. So that policy document aimed at this year, 4 decades ago, who in our State Department, or who in the executive branch of government, who in our Congress is likely at the moment to be composing a document about Saudi Arabia or Nigeria or some other part of the world in 2063? Just ask yourself that question. Without that kind of vision, it is not possible to access the power of self-government that is given to us in our U.S. Constitution. Because the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence and the Federalist Papers and other documents that went into it were written by people who elected to be or to become geniuses. They were not that in one sense as such at the beginning of that revolutionary process. They were being organized by one, Benjamin Franklin. But the idea of identifying with that power of thought and therefore action, that's where you get not only the strength, but you get the ability to, in fact, as has been said here, arrest not the government, but those who have usurped the apparent powers of government. The power of government, of self-government, lies with the American citizen, but that is not so much a right as it is a responsibility, an awesome responsibility. And that was what Lyndon LaRouche exercised as an individual private citizen toward the presidency of the United States. And he was able to communicate to President Ronald Reagan, partially because of a personal meeting that they happened to have in New Hampshire in 1980. But he nonetheless was able to communicate the power of this conception, a conception that no one else had at the point that Lyndon LaRouche generated it, except that Ronald Reagan had it, because it was communicated and he agreed with it. It became his own. This is what we can do, and that is how you make a revolution within the domain of the already bequeathed power bequeathed by the Constitution. There's no reason to change the form of government. What's necessary is to use the actual power of government and think in those terms. And I think that's exactly what would be the basis for American citizens, whether they are candidates for office, perhaps independent candidates for office, or whether they're simply spokespeople or just operating on their own. But to convene a conference on behalf of the true interests of the United States, together with others in other parts of the world. And although people may think that does not have power, the example of what happened in March 23rd of 1983 shows that that is in fact not the case. It does have power, and the power is in the ideas. So on behalf of the LaRouche organization, we want to thank you all for listening and participating today. Hope that this has given you a view of your own power, and we hope that you will join us in the organizing processes in the coming weeks. Thank you.
February 1982, I held a conference, a very largely attended conference in Washington, D.C. It was 400 or 500 celebrities of various nations, largely military and others, U.S. government, East Bloc governments, European, Western European governments. And I presented at that time what I presented as the alternative to Kissinger's policy. The policy, this is the policy which became known as Strategic Defense Initiative. Now, the important thing is to understand what the original SDI was, contrary to the idiocy which you hear in the press today about missile defense, which what you hear in the press is idiocy by people who are worse than idiots. And they don't know anything about missile defense. So what we have to do is something completely different. We do have the ability to devise systems, new kinds of physical systems, which could deal effectively with thermonuclear missiles, that is, render them effectively technologically obsolete down the line. But that was not the extent of my proposal. The proposal was that instead of having the Soviet Union and the United States engage in this crazy chicken game called SALT I and ABM, why don't we find a way out of the conflict itself? How? Because the Soviet economy, like the US economy, is collapsing. The present policies of the US economy, the present policies of the Soviet economy ensure a collapse of those economies, physical collapse. So why don't we change the policy? Why don't we go back to the space program of Kennedy? And let's do what we proved with Kennedy. Remember, according to the estimates which were made in the middle of the 1970s, the United States got more than a dime of additional GNP out of every penny the United States invested in the space program, the Kennedy space program. The point is that since increases in productivity come directly only from improvements in technology derived from fundamental scientific discoveries, the higher the rate you convert fundamental physical discoveries into practice, the greater the rate of increase of productivity per capita of population and per square kilometer of area. The problem of both the Soviet system and our own, though in different degrees, I said at the time, was that the United States was not generating a rate of net growth in physical productivity sufficient to maintain the economy. Therefore, we needed a program for forced draft, science-driven, technological progress with some mission, like the moon mission, but as a byproduct of that mission, such as the moon mission, we would generate spillovers in terms of technological progress by such a crash program to put the United States economy back on the plus side in terms of net growth. The Soviet economy does not work for similar reasons, different but similar reasons. Therefore, if the Soviet Union, with its vast military, scientific, technological capability, were to put that capability in cooperation with us in global technological progress, and if we focused upon developing countries, South America, Africa, Asia, to do what Roosevelt proposed be done for these countries had he not died, then the benefit of such a program would put the two things. Would put the two economies back on the plus side together with Europe, and it would also be a way of creating a global agenda which would solve the conflict problem. Now that was the SDI, the original form, which is what Reagan proposed on March 23rd, 1983 in his television broadcast. Nothing else. Later, to the Heritage Foundation and other clowns, that definition of SDI was sabotaged and destroyed. Now, we did the same thing later, coming out of '85. We had a friend of ours who died, Kraft Erika, who was a leading space scientist, first for Germany, then for the United States. And he had become a friend of ours. When he died of cancer, Helga, my wife, organized a conference sponsored by others for him. So as part of this thing, we put our heads together. What would we do at a conference? We were going to get his friends from all over the world and so forth, and other interested people involved. We had this conference in Virginia, in Reston. What would we do? And I said, well, let's take what he wanted to do and go a step further. Now, Kraft Erika's key favorite project was the automatic industrialization of the moon. And he was the man who had been working on the project in the 1950s and later for the industrial development of the moon, with the idea that the moon would be developed as Kraft Erika and others had proposed also. The moon would be developed as a base, an industrial base on which we would build much of the weight of the spacecraft we'd use to explore the solar system more extensively. So I said, why not go the next step? This was Kraft's project. He laid out a project very well defined. It's one thing to honor it. Let's do something more. Let's go to Mars. So what I did was to take the base work that Kraft had done and others had done, and simply took this and said, here's the obvious. Here's why we have to go to colonize Mars, not to build housing development on Mars, not that sort of thing, but to create a Los Alamos-type science city under the surface of Mars, which would be a base for general beyond Mars space exploration into the universe generally. To get away from the sun, because the sun is a very noisy place, and you can't see things or hear things clearly with all that noise of this big sun rumbling around out there. So if you get a bit further out, at a place with a much thinner atmosphere, you build a science base out there, and you use that as a base in which to deploy other pieces of equipment into Mars nearby space. Then you can conduct observations of the universe, which we can't do from Earth. We can do them. We can get into frequencies and so forth we otherwise can't get into. And this was. But I said the reason for doing this, it would be fairly estimated it would take us 40 years to get a landing on Mars under these kinds of conditions. So let's do it. Why? Because of the spin-off benefits of the science driver project needed to make it in 40 years. It may take you 40 years to get to Mars, but you're going to get a lot of benefits on Earth from the technological spillover in the short run.